And finally, one of your slides showed a list of cities. My hometown of Philadelphia was towards the bottom.
Yeah.
Is it towards the bottom of the top 20 or really towards the bottom?
So what I did here was I took Toronto and I compared its performance in a series of rankings against other North American cities, because I thought that would be interesting for you.
Sure.
So hence you have Mexico City here, which is a North American city. As you can see, Philadelphia there, quality of life, the scores are not so good, 31s, 34s. But actually Philadelphia does quite well, you can see here, in kind of, economic opportunity, investment finance. It's improving very well. I mean, haven't been to Philadelphia much recently. I spent a couple of hours yesterday with Michael Nutter, who seems to me to be an amazing man. And, you know, the best news for Philadelphia since Ed Rendell. I suspect that Philadelphia is going to continue to do well. The issue for Philadelphia is to figure out what it means to be halfway between New York and Washington, D.C.
Has always been.
Yeah.
Hi, Greg. Thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. Part of my job is international benchmarking, and I'm doing this for the third year. Actually, I work for the Toronto Board of Trade, where we compare Toronto vis-a-vis other 23 global cities. And this is
send me your report.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The third edition of the report that we are sort of in the middle of working on, we see that San Francisco and Boston come up as two top cities out of the sample that we have chosen to look at. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on these two cities and perhaps some of the lessons, examples of what we can, learn in Toronto.
Okay, well, the quick answer involves me saying every index is biased because it's all about the questions you ask and the data you look at. And quite commonly, these indexes are skewed or biased by who sponsors them. So don't be surprised if you get the answers you're looking for. If somebody said to me that they were doing an index and Boston and San Francisco came out very highly, I'd say this is obviously a knowledge economy index, right? So you must have asked some specific questions about knowledge economy, particularly knowledge creation. And I would guess in the case of San Francisco, the ability to commercialize knowledge, and I guess in the case of Boston, the ability to attract large-scale corporate sponsorship into research facilities. That's what those two places are very good at, and they have been very good at that. Historically, the DNA is all about that, as you know, and they have that great combination, if you like, of the American investment and business climate that I was describing at the beginning, coupled with concentration of very high knowledge creation. And so far, because they've emerged as centers of learning or of culture, of creativity, or of finance, they haven't been cities that have had huge social costs associated with having been very large manufacturing centers and the costs of, deindustrialization and restructuring. They've avoided some costs too, which has been good for them. They both also have great quality of life. So I would have thought these are very relevant comparators for Toronto, and it seems to me that those are the sorts of places you should be looking at. In terms of their programs of work, you can say firstly about Boston that Massachusetts is clearly an activist state, which is intentional around the economy, which has a Massachusetts economic development strategy, understands what its assets are, knows what it's doing, and the city of Boston and the alliance of institutions, particularly the higher education institutions around it, are in a deep pact together. And that deep pact is about, we stand together and our future is to be a leading knowledge economy center in the world. You can say, if you look at the Northern California experience, I think, that certainly in the Bay Area in general, San Fernando Valley and everything else, what you've got there is a strong coalition of private sector interests supported by, as it were, a drive for quality of life and a more specific division of labor, if I can put it that way, where private sector invest, you have knowledge creation and large amounts of capital in the same place, right? As you have in Toronto. The Canadian banking system and the Canadian university system sitting side by side. And something about bringing money and knowledge together is a pretty important thing. And in San Francisco, they've really learned how to do that. And there, I think, rather than having this kind of grand Massachusetts alliance, what they've had is this strong sense that the public sector will deliver quality of life and an efficient platform and everything else. The private sector will invest in entrepreneurship, will invest in knowledge, and it will invest in risk. So it's been very important. Much, less risk averse than Southern Ontario.
And I'm just wondering, in terms of your slide deck, you had 3 specific regions in the U.S. that you included, but you haven't included Boston, San Francisco. So that's maybe that's where.
Let me say again,
my question's
these are
coming
not 3 regions I chose.
Okay.
These are 3 regions who've been doing a kind of demonstration project in this idea of Nextt Economy. So I'm not picking these regions saying, look at these regions. What I'm saying is, London School of Economics studied these 4 metros from Europe and Asia. The Brookings Institution in DC found 3 metros in the USA that wanted to play in this project. And they've invested in them with corporate resources to try to build the kind of regional economic leadership and governance that we were talking about being necessary. So these are demonstration projects. I'm not saying these are the best. I'm saying even these places are trying to do this now.
Thank you.
Last one.
I am co-chair of something called the Mississauga Summit, which is a civic organization in a city on the side of Toronto. 3rd largest city in Ontario, 6th largest city in Canada. Used to be a suburb, but now is really a city unto itself. As you look at the international comparables, particularly in an era of political change that someone talked about earlier, where the city at the center of the region may be less politically activist because of a political change, are there lessons as to what a former suburb or a city on the periphery of a major city can do? Just follow along what the region's doing, or is there something different or distinct that that city on the edge can do to cause economic development and growth of that city?
Well, I'd like to be frank with you and say, firstly, I think it's very important that you don't do the wrong things. It's very important you don't do what Jersey City tried to do to New York City in the 80s and the 90s, which essentially compete on the basis of tax incentives to decluster the financial services of New York and destabilize that whole cluster. It's very important not to be competitive with the core city that provides the kind of underpinning economic and social rationale for the existence of what you call, the suburb that became a city. That's one thing. So a strategy of complementarity rather than competition is very important, because generally speaking, these suburbs that have become cities are in a situation where it looks smart to compete, but actually, in the end, these kinds of competitions, when they've happened south of the border in the rather less enlightened, USA, have actually resulted in the impoverishment of both parties in the end. So it's very important that you have a strategy of complementarity, that you have some level of regional perspective about that. And if you have that, then you can see the kind of exciting thing. We were just talking about Northern California, you see. It's not just San Francisco that has succeeded. Of course, Oakland has started to succeed again and become a really interesting place in all of this. It's not just the case, for example, where I live, that Manchester has become again a successful city, but that's been fantastic for Leeds, which is just up the road and has done extremely well from this. Even the story of Turin, which I was telling you before, because of the high-speed rail, Turin is now 15 minutes away from Milan. In a certain way, Turin is where it is, doing the industry, because Milan was where it is, doing the finance, doing the innovation, doing the producer services. So it's really important, I think, to be self-determining, but to be complementary, to work on your strengths and work on how you can do that. And also not to give up on the idea that with the sort of wise leadership that I'm sure your organization provides, you can actually contribute to helping Toronto get its house in order as well by offering something which is kind of visionary and more inclusive. That would be, I think, the best advice I can offer.
The last 2 questions that morphed into 3 questions reminds me of a joke I heard recently that goes something like this. There are three types of economists: those who can count and those who can't.